Today what we're going to look at are two objections. Actually, I'm going to give you three. The first one is from Neuroscience. I actually expected this one, and so I prepared slides for it. I really appreciate you guys allowing me to kind of go through these since I had the slides prepared and everything. But let me go ahead and we're going to talk about neuroscience. There's my cover slide. And usually when people bring up neuroscience, I haven't had them get too much into the specifics of it, of what specific study it is that they're listening to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you a paradigmatic study from, actually let me check general, make sure nobody's telling me that you can't hear me. Hopefully you can. Looks like you can hear me. Okay, good. Anyway, so what I want to do is I want to share with you a paradigmatic study from Benjamin Libet in the 1980s. And so we'll go through exactly how his study worked and then what were the problems with it, because I think a lot of the problems that attend the Libet program are going to attend any sort of neuroscientific study that's aimed at showing that either the soul doesn't exist or that mental properties are irrelevant to the physical. So what did Libet do? Well, what he did was he hooked up participants to this machine, that electrodes on their head that would measure the electrical activity in their brain. And so this is called electroencephalography. And what it would do is it would basically he would sit them down and they'd be watching this like really precise clock, and they would move a finger and they would record the time that they formed the intention of moving their finger. And so what he would do is he would graph like when did they form this intention on top of when the brain activity happened. So you got this line of brain activity and what was the specific time that they formed this intention, and he placed it in that graph. And so we see our line graph here, or our timeline I should say. And what he noted was that there was this brain event B1, which is the rising electrical potential in the brain, that occurred prior to M1, which is the mental event of them forming the intention. And then you had B2, B3, B4, and then finally the movement of the finger. And so what a lot of people took this to mean was, well, obviously the brain is causing the mental and these B2 through B4. It can't be that M1 causes B1 because M1 occurs after B1. And so it must be that the brain is primary causing the mental, not the other way around. And so B1 causes this chain of events to happen. So this is taken to show that our mental events, forming intentions, doing those sorts of things, in this case it was forming an intention, are caused by the physical. And so a lot of people have taken this, or at least experiments like this, to show that the mental, if it is separate from the brain, then it wouldn't be relevant. So what are some problems with Libet's experiment that would cause us to doubt that result? Well, there's a few. So first of all that we know is that B1 begins before M1 ends. That's all we know. Because if you think about it, the participant, when they are reporting forming the intention, they are reporting when the intention is formed. That is to say, the end of it. The forming of the intention is completed. That's the time that they're reporting. Well, if M1 is an instantaneous event, it has no duration of time whatsoever, well and good, for our experiment. But if M1 takes time to occur, if it's not instantaneous, if it has any duration to it at all, then we got a bit of a problem here, because we don't know when M1 begins. And it could be that M1 begins before B1, or perhaps coincident with B1, and that M1 culminates when they report it. If that's the case, then it wouldn't all show even that M1 comes after B1. It could be that M1 and B1 happen at the same time, or even that M1 precedes B1, because what would be relevant here isn't when the event is done, but when it begins. And so the first problem is again that the timing is a bit off for what we want it to say, which is that B1 begins before M1 begins, and the experiment doesn't actually show that. And number two, at best, it shows that B1, like the most that this experiment could show, is that B1 may be a necessary, but it doesn't show that it's a sufficient condition for B2 through B4. So it could be the case that you need both B1 and M1 in order to get B2. If you get B1 but then you don't have M1, do you still have B2 through B4? Or if you have B1 but you don't have M1, does it go on without it? In other words, what would the experiment have to show in order to show that? It would have to show that the movement of the finger and these brain events all occur whether or not the participant forms the intention. So even if they don't form the intention to move their finger, nonetheless they're moving their finger when they're meant to be in the experiment. Not only did the experiment not show that, but our own experience seems to be that with the rare exception of like eye twitches and things like that, for the most part, our movements only occur when we intend them to, unless there's some sort of disorder going on. And so it seems like our everyday experience would be contrary to that result. But at the least, it certainly wasn't affirmed that this forming the intention is unnecessary for these brain events. And so if M1 is a part of the sufficient conditions for B2, then the mental does cause the physical. Perhaps it's not the sole cause, but it is certainly a cause of B2. And number 3, the timings rely on testimony. And so the participant has to report the time that they formed the intention. And this immediately raises a problem because now there's 2 intentions involved. There's the intention to move the finger, but then there's also the intention to report moving the finger. And so which one is M1, right? They're taking note of the time with the intention to report it. If that is a different event, and it is, we can describe it differently, that is a different event than the intent to move the finger, it could be the case that M1, the time that's reported, is the second intention to report rather than the first intention to move the finger. And if that's the case, then we don't know exactly when the intention to move the finger occurred. And so we don't know that the real M1 prime perhaps, actually does come after B1. We wouldn't have a time for that. We would just have the time for the intention to report. And finally, number 4, the experiment relies on mental events causing physical events. Namely, the experiment relies on the mental event of the participant, their mental events of intending to report the time to cause them to speak out the time that they recorded. And so if it isn't the case that their intention to report this accurately is causing them to speak, then the results of the experiment would be greatly undermined because we wouldn't have any reason to think that what they're reporting is accurate. It's just some sort of electrical activity in the brain. There's no reason to think that it would be intended towards telling us the truth. And so the whole crux of the experiment relies on the mental causing the physical. It also relies on the reporting the data from the experiment, relies on the mental events of the scientists, their awareness and their thoughts about the experiment and their intention to report their results. And so both the actual experiment itself and the results of the experiment published by the scientists rely on mental events causing physical. And so if it really does show that mental events don't cause the physical, then we'd have a great reason to suspect this study or the scientific experiment, and therefore wouldn't be safe in its conclusion, or at least the conclusion that some draw from it, that the mental causes the physical. And so this is one of the reasons why I think that neuroscience just doesn't have access to this. Because neuroscience, being one of the sciences, is in the realm of the physical, it just doesn't have access to the immaterial or the non-physical. And so trying to prove or disprove non-physical things with strict physical experiments is going to be problematic. We're going to be looking for things like philosophy, which were the philosophical arguments that I presented in our first discussion. So the second objection is panpsychism. And I have to admit, when I was first presented panpsychism, when somebody first responded to me with that a long time ago, I thought they were a kook, or I wasn't sure what to make of it. I thought maybe they were messing with me. But apparently this is, a lot of people do believe this. And so it's worth talking about. So panpsychism is the view that essentially the consciousness is fundamental, that all things that exist, all physical things that exist, have some level of consciousness. And so that when we have complex beings, we can have a complex consciousness. And so that would entail things like a pair of boots, or a plant, or an umbrella. That these various different objects are conscious at some level. And so that is taken to be an explanation for how we get consciousness in human beings. So the first problem that I have with panpsychism is that it does not actually explain what needs explaining. Because remember that our whole project here started out trying to explain human consciousness. Why do we have these conscious states of awareness that we experience ourselves? And so we started off by asking about the unified consciousness, and it's unclear exactly how you connect consciousness of fundamental particles to that unified consciousness. So by way of example, think of a stadium full of people. Well, each person has an individual what it is like to be them, but there is no what it is like to be all of them. And so there's no reason to think that even if the fundamental particles of our brain were conscious, that there's a unified what it is like to be our brain. Yet what we experience is a unified what it is like to be us. We have a single unified perspective, a single what it is like to be us. And so since panpsychism doesn't actually explain that, and so it's unclear how this actually objects to the soul, or the argument from consciousness for the soul. Secondly, it is ad hoc. There aren't, to my knowledge, independent reasons for thinking that your pair of shoes is conscious. This seems to be something that's sort of just posited without independent reasons to believe that it's true. And it's not strictly entailed by or implied by the data. It could be your soul, for example. And so, something is implied, but it seems ad hoc. We don't have independent reasons to think that, a chair is conscious. But we do have independent reasons to think that you're a soul. If the arguments for God if the other arguments for God's existence are valid, then those are other arguments or reasons to think that there are such things as souls, because that's what God would be, as a mental substance. And that's what I mean by soul. And so at least one soul exists on that view. And so it's not entirely ad hoc in the way that panpsychism seems to be. Thirdly, it's strongly counterintuitive. When I open an umbrella in the rain, I don't wonder if the umbrella perhaps doesn't want to be wet or is bothered by the rain. And it's just not at all the way the world seems to us. I'm currently sitting at a counter. I don't ever have the thought, I wonder what the counter thinks of this presentation. And so there's no awareness like that. And frankly, it seems somewhat incoherent, because what they'll usually say, well, it's some level of consciousness. Well, what does that mean? I've not heard it explained in detail. It's just a phrase, some level of consciousness. Well, I don't even know what that means. Some level of consciousness. In what way is a countertop conscious? Barring some sort of description, it's completely mysterious to me what that would even mean for a countertop to be conscious. And so it's strongly counterintuitive for those reasons. It also involves an explosion of complexity. So there are two different types of complexity. We can have quantitative complexity, where we're multiplying the number of things. That's quantitative complexity. And then we can have qualitative complexity, where we're multiplying the number of attributes or the causal powers of a thing. And so, it would be increasing qualitative complexity to say that my car can also fly, for example. It's giving it a new ability that it didn't have before. And so we have this radical explosion of complexity because we're positing that all of the material in the universe has this additional quality of being conscious. And so what we'd want to do here is we'd want to get some sort of return on that investment. So think of complexity like you're paying out of complexity, and what you want in return is explanatory power and scope. So you're willing to give up some complexity in order to get a better explanation, or to explain the phenomena better. But as I pointed out, number one, we don't actually get the explanation for the phenomena we're after, which is human consciousness. And so we have this explosion of complexity, this investment, but there's no return on that investment in forms of an explanation. And so for those reasons, it seems to me that panpsychism should be rejected. I'll give you one more objection, and then if anybody has any questions, we'll go over those. And that objection is that what you are fundamentally is actually not a substance at all, that you are your memories. Excuse me. This was presented in a debate with Richard Swinburne on, I believe it was on Unbelievable. And the view is that you are, that you remain you because you have mostly the same memories. And so that's kind of how we account for you still being you, even shortly later. Well, one of the problems with that is we can take this person, we'll call him Frank, and he at P1 is a child. At P2, we'll say he's middle-aged, and then P3, we'll say he's a senior citizen. Well, perhaps P1 and P2 share enough memories that they would be the same person, that they would qualify or fit this bar. But by P3, maybe P3 and P2 remember enough. The senior citizen can remember middle age. But it's unlikely that P3 will remember very much about being a small child. I'm middle-aged and I already don't remember a lot about being a small child. And so you can imagine doubling your age and see how much you remember then. And so P3 doesn't have the same memories, or even largely the same memories as P1. And so while P1 would be identical to P2 and P2 would be identical to P3, P3 is not identical to P1. So this seems to violate the law of the transitivity of identity, because which would say that if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then A is equal to C. Well, here we're saying that A and C are not equal, even though they're both equal to B, which would be problematic. Now, obviously, this is an identity relationship, but it's not the same as the law of transitivity. But you can see how this is problematic to say that P1 and P2 are the same person, P2 and P3 are the same person, but P3 and P1 are not. So it seems problematic. For those reasons, it seems to me like this is an insufficient explanation of what you are. We need to be looking for something else. And as I gave reasons in our other discussion, it seems to me that what you are is an immaterial soul. So thank you for listening. If you found this helpful, please like and subscribe. Please also look at the show notes in order to find a link to our group so that you can join our next discussion. I look forward to chatting with you.